Welcome everyone to the very first Greater European Conference. My name is Philippe Lefebvre. I'm the chair of the Institute for a Greater Europe. It is my absolute privilege and pleasure to welcome you here today, the culmination of months of work from all of our members and our partners, the Youth Association for a Greater Europe. A small housekeeping note, to be told to mention about the fire evacuation plan. There is one. And the emergency skip can be found on the reverse side of the building, and the meeting point is across the road. Otherwise, we have a very interesting lineup for you today. We have the panel spread across the day. We will be in this room for the duration of the conference. I want to start my intervention by talking a little bit about Greater Europe, how I got to it, and why I believe it is a very important part of what we do on a day-to-day basis in Europe and across political capitals on the continent and beyond. I first came to Greater Europe in 2016, following, of course, the Brexit referendum, where myself and I think many other Brits and fellow Europeans were questioning themselves about what it meant to be European. They felt that the European Union no longer necessarily was the one and only source of Europeanness for countries. So where do we go from there? Now, many students already thought about this, and the Youth Association for a Greater Europe had materialized out of this wish to bring students across Europe closer together, and I latched onto it with a keenness. I was very happy to be involved at the very beginning in their meetings. Very quickly, I understood this is an academic term we could spread further, and myself and many others embarked on a journey to create a small think tank to explore this on a day-to-day basis and also build up other young students and professionals at the same time. Since 2016, we founded the Institute 2 years later, and I'm very proud to say we have become over 100 strong with members across Europe and beyond. And every day we're running new events, new podcast publications, and I'm very proud this is one of our first large in-person meetings where we can gather everyone together today. As we've seen from the European political community, the time is right for these type of discussions to take place. There is a need and a willingness to discuss about a Europe that's beyond just the pure institutions we have now and excludes those actors that no longer work within the European political community that we value so much. Furthermore, it's very clear that Europe's place in the world is being questioned, if not challenged openly. And it's important we look at how Europe as a whole, as a collective, can really push its ideas across the world and collaborate in the most effective way possible. We look obviously at the future relationship between Europe and North America, beyond the US with Canada, Mexico, the Caribbean. And we look, of course, at Europe, the rest of Eurasia, as it were, further east. These are some of the themes we'll be touching on today, and I'm incredibly happy to welcome all the speakers that we come across to speak to you. This will be recorded, and so we hope that this will live on, and this will be the first of many events to be able to institutionalize such a valuable discussion among young students, professionals, and think tankers, policymakers alike. But thank you very much for coming. My absolute pleasure, and welcome to the Great European Conference once again. My opening remarks done, I now wish to yield to the President of the Youth Association for a Greater Europe, Diana, who will be joining us from online.
So, dear honorable guests, dear friends, dear speakers, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very glad to welcome you today at the Greater European Conference, and I'm particularly grateful to Philip, the chair of the Institute for a Greater Europe, and all IGE teams for organizing such a high quality event and for inviting me. Thank you very much, Philip. As you just reminded, the Youth Association for a Greater Europe, the association I'm the president of, is celebrating its 10th anniversary. Indeed, our founding president, Lara Kaut, and her team founded the, oh, you see me now. So the association was founded by our president, our former president, Lara Kaut, and her team. They founded it in Paris in 2012. And the Europe in which they found the association was very different from today. Our purpose then, and it has not changed so far, was to build a greater Europe through active young students and professionals, and we believed it to be the best way to set a climate of trust on our continent enabling long-term cultural, educational, and even economic interactions. It is indeed the kinds of cooperation we can achieve at our level, and then we can just believe it to be powerful enough to influence the political and diplomatic interactions. Our last summer forums, so this was the main event we've always organized, the Greater Europe meetings, which Philip was also mentioning. The last one took place in Vienna in cooperation with the OSCE. And altogether, since 2012, our forum gathered around 600 young and talented students and professionals all across Europe. And as we witness today's situation, one can ask a simple question: was it worth it? My answer is definitely yes, because as Philip attempted to define Greater Europe above, the Greater Europe is also about common values of openness in international relations and democracies in our society. And those values are still shared by a lot of young people all across Europe. And as long as these values are shared, we will always find ways to find platforms such as today's, those platforms for open discussions, and this work will be needed in the post-war period. Also, our work was definitely worth it because the Institute kept their work on articles, on journals, on podcasts, and today's discussions in the actual context. And the very idea of the Institute was born at one of the forums, as Philip just mentioned it also. And I'm very, very proud of the work of the Institute and all the way it came. So I'm really looking forward for today's discussion because me personally, I'm very interested in seeing what our experts can say, what input they can give us to reflect on what's happening today. And I hope those ideas will help us to build peace again on the European continent. So good luck for all your day. I will be following the discussions as well. Zoom enables us to do that, so it's great. And yes, thank you again.
We've been working together for several years now, and it's an absolute pleasure for us to be able to come together. It's one of the first events our organization has worked together despite sharing the same name, and it's really a fantastic opportunity. Whilst he cannot join us today, we would like to welcome the first Vice-President of the European Parliament, Mr. Othmar Karas, who has sent us a video on his reflections about Greater Europe and Europe's place in the world.
Honorable Chairman Lefebvre, Honorable President Rajib, Honorable Vice President Freudenstein, dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first edition of the Greater European Conference. And above all, welcome in Europe. Unfortunately, I cannot be with you live today. Urgent obligations keep me in Austria. Still, I want to use the opportunity to remotely contribute to your event. First, happy birthday and congratulations to your initiative. It provides a space for young academics and professionals to discuss about the future of the European project. This is exactly what Europe needs: innovative ideas, open dialogue and joint action. Your conference falls into very eventful times. Europe and the world are in crisis mode. We are experiencing more global challenges at the same time than ever since 1945. The present energy crisis shows how dependent we have become and how essential it is to expand renewables rapidly. The current massive inflation is hitting us all. The war against Ukraine will and must lead to a new debate on EU defense policy. Trust in political institutions and decision makers is at a dangerous low. At the same time, the climate crisis is imminent, the pandemic is not over yet, and migration flows are rising. Nobody can manage these challenges alone. There are no simple answers to complex problems. Once and for all, the times of nationalism and populism must be over. We need to quickly develop and implement European solutions to all key issues of our time. Recently, I represented the European Parliament in the capital of Ukraine, Kiev. My visit fell on the very day when Putin announced the annexation of further Ukraine territories. With the recent bombings, the illegal shame referenda, the nuclear threat, and the civilian mobilization, Putin continues to turn the escalation screw. I am deeply impressed by the determination and joint will of the Ukrainian people, not only in defending their homeland and our common values, but also for rebuilding the country with democratic reforms. It is crystal clear. We must stop Putin with everything we have in our power. We must support Ukraine with everything the country needs. And we must manage the consequences of the war, humanitarian, economical, and social, together. At the same time, we support the democratic opposition in Belarus, and we offer our hands to the countries of the Western Balkans so that they can move forward on their path to Europe. Without stability and security in Europe's neighborhood, there is no stability and security in Europe. In this context, we shall never forget one thing. Europe is not just happening in some EU building in Brussels or Strasbourg or Luxembourg. Europe is nothing else than all of us. The future of Europe lies in our hands, and it demands very special care. The European Union is not finished, and most certainly it will never be. All of us can contribute to developing further our cooperation. In this spirit, I wish you a successful conference and many fruitful conversations. Though that we can broadly greet each other at the next edition. Welcome to a new and better Europe. Welcome in a more democratic, green, social and digital Europe. Thank you and all the best.
I'll start my next introduction for Mr. Dr. Friedenstein, who is the Vice President of GlobSec and Head of GlobSec Brussels. He joined us with a long career in the technical community, and we could not be happier inviting him today for his reflections on the war in Ukraine and where it places Europe geopolitically. So please, over to you, Roman, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you today.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers. Cheers.
Right. Well, good morning, everyone, and congratulations. I think we can congratulate each other for getting up early on a Saturday morning.
Yeah, I can't even find
Rainy Brussels.
Oh, that's what I find it so strange.
Before I get into my keynote, I would like to emphasize here that
I heard.
what I learned about Greater Europe this morning reminds me very much of the history of Genesis, which started out in Bratislava.
It's much lower. It's
as a
gonna be.
initiative. Actually, to be more precise, in Banska Bystrica, which is a
It's not there, so I do want to go on that one.
So the GlobSec started out very much like this, with a couple of idealistic youngsters set out to make their contribution to Europe and to global politics. Now, if I were British or American, I would have to start this with a joke or some kind of anecdote. Thank God I'm German, so all I have to come up with, all I can come up with is the story. And this involves Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, who, say 120 years ago, visited a shtetl in what is now Western Ukraine, And he was always a man under pressure and had very little time. So he wanted to meet the local rabbi, and he told him, "Look, Rabbi, I don't have much time. Can you please describe the situation of the Jews in this town
I'm
in
finding
one
it.
word?" And the rabbi said, "Good." That's not what Theodor Herzl wanted to hear.
Is
He
this
said, "Okay,
face?
in 2 words, not good."
I'll check my phone right
And I think that about sums up the situation that Europe and the world are in these dramatic days. And I'm going to reverse the sequence of good and not good, and I'll start with the not good, and end on a slightly more optimistic note. And then at the very end, have what should happen now, what follows from all this. So what is not good? Obviously, the biggest war in Europe since World War II. No end in sight. Plenty of potential for escalation, including nuclear war. That's one. Second, Russia isn't really isolated. I mean, we sometimes tell that to ourselves, that with sanctions and with other measures in helping Ukraine, we have managed to isolate Russia. That's not true. I mean, we could see in all the UN votes, for example, in recent months, that I wouldn't say Russia has a big constituency, globally speaking, but there are certainly a number of countries that are literally sitting on the fence here, and not siding with Ukraine as they should, in the view of many Europeans. What is more, the Russia-China axis is still holding. I mean, we know that in recent weeks, China has expressed apprehensions and hesitations and worries about the war, but if by and large it is still sticking to Russia, simply because China and Russia are two autocracies that, with all due differences between them, still have the same existential enemy, and that is the West. That's us, right? And that keeps them together for the moment. Third point that is not good. National populism looks like it's on the rise again inside the West and inside the European Union, in fact. Just look at the recent elections in Italy and in Sweden, and the evident staying power of autocratically oriented governments in member states such as Hungary and Poland. So populism is growing, winter is coming, a big crisis is looming, everyone says that. Look at the stock markets in the last couple of months. And this crisis is more than just an energy crisis. Actually, it may still be for the European Union. And in that crisis, actually not just help for Ukraine may be at stake, which has held out beautifully until now, but that help is still not out of the woods in the next couple of months. And if we get fundamental splits about Ukraine inside the European Union, then the existence of European integration is at stake. So that was not good. Now 3 times good. Ukraine is winning the war. It's a question of time, of course, and we don't know how much time, but Ukraine is winning. I mean, there's an amazing number of military experts that are saying now, sometimes the same people that have predicted Ukraine is losing in the very first days of the war, they're now saying there is no way Russia can, on the battlefield, reverse the Ukrainian advances. So then the nuclear escalation question, there is no indication that Russia is preparing to use either tactical or strategic nuclear weapons. That's one. And second, of course, the big question is how Ukraine and how the West should respond to these threats. But I would claim that there are very good indications that nuclear threats from Russia can be deterred, that the use of nuclear weapons can be deterred, and therefore nuclear escalation is by no means a given. What is more is that Putin probably, arguably, has brought his own end closer by starting this war. And actually by losing it, he will even accelerate that process. It doesn't mean that what comes after Putin will necessarily be a bunch of liberal Democrats in Moscow, at least not immediately. I could imagine a 1917 scenario where we get 2 revolutions in 1 year. One might be a right-wing coup, a kind of takeover by those extreme nationalists that are already in a veiled way criticizing Putin today. But those people, I think it will become pretty apparent that those people will not bring Russia closer to the solution of its existential problems that by that time will be obvious, even more obvious than today, militarily, economically, in terms of cohesion of the Russian Federation, which will be at stake, and in terms of upholding public order, which I see collapsing in some parts of Russia in the near future. So that we might very well see a follow-up regime change in Russia, which then moves Russia in a completely different direction. Just to sum up this point, and this is really important. There's no guarantee that Putin's successors will be much better than him. But looking at the multiple existential crises Russia will be in by that time, when he leaves the Kremlin, probably against his will and maybe not even alive, the incentives for his successors to do things fundamentally different will be humongous. I think that can be said with some certainty. So second point, which is good, that in fact NATO is back. I know there are some people in this town, there are some people also maybe in Paris that are not entirely happy about this fact. But I can speak for my organization, Hilfswerk, and for pretty much the whole of Central Europe, you know, maybe with the exception of Hungary, but certainly including Poland. All these nations are happy as a fish that NATO is back, and that the credibility of people who claimed NATO is brain dead, such as President Macron a couple of years ago, has suffered in this crisis. And that's a good thing, because we do not believe in Europe going its own way outside of the West and outside of the transatlantic alliance. So the West is more united than ever in the last 10 years. And what's more, if you look at who is really helping Ukraine with what instruments, frankly speaking, without the US and the UK, Ukraine would not be in the winning situation that it is now, and it probably very arguably would have substantially lost the war and would not exist in the form it is existing today anymore. So let me put it even more bluntly. If it was only up to the European Union and its admittedly admirable assistance to Ukraine, including military assistance, all this would not have been enough to save Ukraine from Russian attack. So the European Union, and this goes back to the previous point that I made, that the West is back, that the transatlantic alliance is back. The European Union needs transatlantic partners. And those include, as I said before, first and foremost, the US and the UK. So when we talk about the global West, and some people warn of the danger of a new Cold War, some people warn of the sustainability of a model of the world which puts autocracies against democracies. I say there are some valid points in this, right? No model of dividing the world into good and evil, black and white, is fully sustainable and always hits every situation on the spot. But if you define the West as a set of concentric circles with the transatlantic relationship in the middle, like-minded democracies around that. And then a couple of countries that may be autocracies, but do not present a fundamental existential threat to the West and are very much willing to cooperate against countries like Russia and China, then I think you come closer to a differentiated picture of the world, which works in concentric circles. Third point that is good. This new rise of populism is by no means the first, and by no means the first existential crisis the European Union is in. In fact, I mean, since the global financial and economic crisis of 2008 and following, the European Union has almost relentlessly been in crisis mode. So first of all, we're used to it. Remember the gloomy mood in this town. Maybe some of you haven't been around at that time, but I certainly very well remember how in 2016-17, Philippe alluded to the Brexit referendum. We might add the election of Donald Trump to president in that same year. And the mood in early 2017 in Brussels was absolutely catastrophic. Serious people were saying that for the first time, the European Union is looking into the abyss of possibly the end of its own existence. So compared to that, the current crisis actually is not the worst that we've been in so far. I think that as far as winter is coming, we've got the immediate energy question pretty much sorted out. And no one's going to freeze to death in the European Union. The more difficult problem actually may be the economic recession that we're all facing. And indeed, there are indications in some member states, not least my own Germany, where we see some popular fundamental criticism of the Ukraine policy of the government. But frankly speaking, this is far from being even a sizable minority, let alone majority of society. Public opinion is pretty consistent on helping Ukraine and resisting Russia. And if we look at European Union institutions, I mean, look at how Ursula von der Leyen has risen to the occasion of the Ukraine war by very staunchly, in unprecedented words, steering or helping to steer the European Union in a direction that completely supports Ukraine as the country that has been attacked. Borrell's, the High Representative's speech to the ambassadors a couple of days ago was another sign that the EU is really shaping up here in terms of its positioning. Borrell said quite openly, we have unfortunately underestimated Russia's aggressiveness. We have not listened to the people that warned us about Russia. And so I see that there is a real turnaround here. It will take some time for this to have political effects, but it has certainly begun. And the populism, I mean, it's not a unified pan-European wave of the same kind of populism. Just one example, you look at northern and southern national populism and on all questions about fiscal policies and spending, the role of the state in the economy and so on. Northern and southern populisms are quite at opposite ends in the political spectrum in Europe. So I don't think the Sweden Democrats would really have much in common, especially when it comes to solving the current crisis, much in common with, for example, Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy. So very briefly, what should happen? Helping Ukraine to win. I think we also need some collective coming to terms with our past misperceptions. I quoted von der Leyen, I quoted Borrell. There has to be a more consistent effort, and this is an appeal to political science and to history and to journalism, to make a more concerted effort and look at why, what precisely drove Europeans, so many Europeans, to be so wrong about the strategic situation in Europe, and more precisely about Russia in particular, and autocracy in general. And it also has a lot to do, and I'm coming back to this in my personal view, it has a lot to do with a certain tradition of anti-Americanism that I think is being exposed as we speak as something that is not good for Europe. And that brings me to the next point. I think we should critically question the notion of strategic autonomy for the European Union. I'm probably stepping on some people's toes right now, but here I am. Strategic autonomy has already notoriously gotten less attention and less exposure in, for example, the Strategic Compass that was published a couple of months ago in the European Union. That was adopted by the Council. Strategic autonomy is totally okay. I think ultimately it depends on what we mean by it. It's totally okay when it refers to supply chains, to strategic independence in energy, and so on. Strategic autonomy is questionable when it refers to European decoupling from the United States of America. That's when it gets problematic. And that's where the new member states, the Eastern flank countries, and actually a good number of North European countries in the meantime, have become extremely critical of the notion of strategic autonomy. So I think the term should be dropped as a sign, as a gesture, and replaced by what I would consider strategic responsibility. Responsibility towards our voters and citizens who deserve to know from their leaders that freedom has a price, that we need to spend way more for our defense, for our security, for deterrence than we have in the last 20 years. Responsibility towards our neighbors, such as Ukraine, that deserve our solidarity because actually they're dying, they're fighting for our fundamental values. And responsibility also vis-a-vis our allies, such as the United States, which spend way higher percentage of their GDP on defense than we do for our security. So we need to make more efforts on our own. We need to talk in a different way to those who guarantee our security on all levels of deterrence: hybrid, conventional, tactical nuclear, and strategic nuclear. And the sitting on the fence about China has to stop. Europe is not some kind of third party to a great power conflict between Beijing and Washington. That is not our future. Our future is, as I said before, fundamentally on the side of democracies. We could talk about tactical differences with the United States, and I think the US government is more than willing to acknowledge that. But we should, instead of emphasizing our differences in China policy to the US, we should look for the points where we can cooperate, the fundamental interests that we have in common, faced with a bunch of autocracies, most of all Russia and China, that are more than willing to cooperate against us. In that situation, to talk about some kind of European separate way to deal with China, I think is completely self-defeating. And the last point, geopolitics. Careful what you wish for. I mean, just a couple of days ago, the Brussels Institute for Geopolitics has been founded. It's very laudable because Brussels has been sorely lacking in expertise, for example, on Russia and even more on China in recent years. If that improves, it's beautiful, and that has my full support. But if geopolitics as an analytical tool means that countries' fates are determined by their geographical position, then we're already a long way to adopting the optics of such people like John Mearsheimer, for example, the ultra-realist who still believes that that the Ukraine war is the West's fault. We shouldn't have poked the bear in the eye. All this completely deprives Ukraine of agency. As if there had not been a Euromaidan, as if there had not been a revolution of dignity in Ukraine, which was that Ukrainians wanted to belong to the West, right? It wasn't us forcing Ukraine. It wasn't even us persuading Ukraine. Actually, you know how many skeptics about Ukrainian membership in European Union and NATO there are in the West. So the Mearsheimer argument and what I would call the ultra geopolitical argument that, you know, great powers are great powers. Boys will be boys, right? They want to control their environment. But you know, if a country like Ukraine lives next to a great power like Russia, too bad. They can't decide their own fate. That goes fundamentally against everything European Union stands for. And therefore, as I said, geopolitics must be very, very closely defined. Otherwise, it gets us into a completely wrong course. So strengthening the West and taking into account all these points that I outlined, why the West must stay united and why the transatlantic relationship is the core of a global West. I think that is what we should focus on now. And of course, most importantly, remain optimistic. So from 2 words, not good, to 1 word, the situation is good. It could be much, much worse. Thank you very much.
We have time for 1 round of questions. So we'll take maybe 1 or 2 questions from the audience. I think we have a question online as well. Are there any questions in the audience for each team? Yeah.
Yes, hi, my name is Sandra Kuri from Keeping Channels Open. My question is actually about Germany. Do you think any of the criticisms of Germany have been justified, that they haven't stepped up? And I spoke to a Polish person last week who was vitriolic against Germany, and I was trying to defend. And then, bearing in mind that, would it be useful if the next NATO Secretary General was a German?
Well, I mean, starting with the NATO Sec Gen, I don't think the nationality would already indicate, I mean, it would depend who it is, right? It might help in advocating in Germany to play a stronger role in NATO. I think that's probably what you're referring to. Yes, it might help, but again, it would really depend on who it is. As to Germany as a whole, I think the glass is half full. Germany has come an incredibly long way in thinking about Russia, in thinking about solidarity with Ukraine and in militarily assisting Ukraine. Germany is now at a point where no one, even when the full invasion started on 24th of February, no one suspected that Germany would be in this position. And yet, it's absolutely shameful how the German government has to be pushed, pulled, and cajoled in every inch in further developing military assistance. If you correlate military assistance to GDP of a country, and you make a list, and the Kiel Institute of Global Economics does this list regularly now during the Ukraine war, Germany is at number 18 worldwide in helping Ukraine, right? I mean, that is absolutely shameful considering the importance that this Russian aggression has existentially for the European Union as a whole and Germany in particular. So I'm saying the glass is half full, but Germany's allies should step up in trying to persuade the government to stop looking for excuses why more heavy weapons cannot deliver. If the German Chancellor's office devoted the same energy to actually looking for solutions that is now spending in looking for excuses why Germany can't do more, Ukraine would be in a much, much better position. So, you know, there's a whole, I could talk about this for at length. There's a whole bunch of reasons why Germany is acting this way, why Germany is so slow. Well, we might go into that later on.
Thank you. The question online about nuclear triggers.
Yeah, we have one question from Laura. She's saying the following: history showed us that many predictions of experts were not that true. Could you please tell us one indicator that might seem not important but could trigger a nuclear event with consequences for the entire world? Something that perhaps many experts and historians don't look at. for now? Thank you.
Well, if you look at the nuclear debate, I think you've got a very, very broad spectrum of expert opinion right now. I mean, you've got political leaders, including President Biden, by the way, I mean, who during a fundraising dinner, a closed shop dinner, spoke of possibility of Armageddon. And then you have other leaders, for example, from Ukraine, who are saying either that it's extremely improbable that Putin uses nuclear weapons, or they say it will not make a difference. I mean, unless he really starts World War III with one push of the button, which again, experts are saying is not really possible. There's a whole chain of command and the use of strategic nuclear weapons, for example. I mean, this is just not going to happen. If anything's going to happen, it's a slow escalation with many off-ramps in the meantime. So the spectrum is very broad. I don't think there's a scenario that we haven't discussed in the past couple of months and especially weeks. It's ultimately a question of what the experts and the respective leaders believe. And I personally think that, yes, Putin's threats should be taken seriously, but the consequence of that cannot be to pressure Ukraine into negotiation. By the way, Putin doesn't want to negotiate with Ukraine, he wants to negotiate with the US. And for the US to negotiate on behalf of Ukraine, any kind of territorial compromise would be giving into nuclear blackmail. And it would actually then cause the next phase in nuclear blackmail against other nations. And ultimately, it might actually hasten nuclear war, because at a certain point, the West will not be able to give in to nuclear blackmail anymore. So I'm saying if we give in now, we make things much worse. And the taking Russia's threat seriously means better deterring Russia from using nuclear weapons. That's the consequence.
Great. Well, we're going to try the video again, so thank you very much.